In the cool early morning of June 18, 1982, a postal worker was out, likely on their morning route crossing Blackfriars Bridge in London. But on this day, the postman noticed something peculiar hanging from scaffolding underneath the bridge. A body. What the postman didn't know at the time was this man was the chairman of one of Italy's largest private banks, Banco Ambrosiano. His name was Roberto Calvi, nicknamed God's Banker. In the years leading up to his death, Roberto Calvi had been running one of the largest banking frauds in history, putting Banco Ambrosiano in a $1.3 billion hole at the time of his death. But how did he get to this point without anyone noticing? His death is still shrouded in mystery to this day, as we uncover how he fooled the entire banking world while partnering with some of Italy's most elite and corrupt groups, including the Mafia, Masonic lodges, and most shockingly, the Vatican itself. The question still lingers today. Who killed Roberto Calvi, and why? In the aftermath of World War II, Italy, along with most of Europe, found itself rebuilding. In 1946, the monarchy was abolished and replaced by the newly established republic in 1947. At this time, the younger generation of Italians found themselves seeking stability and opportunity in this post-war era, including Roberto Calvi, who joined Banco Ambrosiano at the young age of 27. Banco Ambrosiano was a private Catholic bank founded in 1896, with a mission to serve Catholic families and businesses. By the 1960s, it was a small and relatively unimportant player in Italy's banking sector. In 1967, Roberto Calvi met an Italian banker by the name Michele Sindona, nicknamed the Shark due to his financial prowess. Sindona became a mentor of sorts to Calvi. But behind the facade of the successful banker, Michele Sindona was heavily involved in massive fraud and money laundering for the mob. In the early 1950s, Sindona moved to Milan and worked as a tax lawyer for wealthy Italians. He would use various methods like offshore companies and intricate corporate structures to move money around and hide taxable income so his clients could avoid paying taxes. At the age of 30, he founded his holding company, Fasco AG. It was at this time his talent for moving money to Switzerland and Liechtenstein to avoid taxes would catch the eye of major mafia bosses. By 1957, he was chosen by the Gambino family to manage the profits from their heroin dealings. Around this time, or shortly after, Sindona acquired the first of many banks through Fasco. But the Shark was far from finished. He began his dealings with the Vatican in the mid-1960s after meeting Giovanni Montini, at the time the Archdiocese of Milan, and in 1963 he was elected Pope Paul VI. No deep personal relationship was documented between Sindona and Montini, but it was still enough for Sindona to get his foot in the Vatican's door. In 1971, Sindona, Calvi, and Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, who was also the president of the Vatican Bank, co-founded Cisalpine Overseas Bank in the Bahamas, eventually becoming one of Calvi's biggest hubs for his illicit dealings. But shortly after getting Cisalpine Bank off the ground, Sindona's empire would crumble. In 1974, the collapse of Franklin National Bank in Long Island and Banca Privata Italiana triggered investigations into Sindona's dealings. All of his illicit dealings through the years were finally exposed. Because of this, he lost most of the banks he acquired over the past 17 years through his fraudulent practices. And in 1980, Sindona was convicted on 65 counts of fraud, along with other related charges. He would later be given a life sentence in Italy for the murder of lawyer Giorgio Ambrosoli. the liquidator of Sindona's banks, who was killed by 3 Mafia men commissioned by the shark. Michele Sindona only managed to survive 2 days into his life sentence, when he drank coffee laced with cyanide in Voghera prison. On March 22, 1986, he died in the Voghera hospital after being in a coma for 2 days. Michele Sindona, Calvi's mentor, was dead. Now it was time for Roberto Calvi to build a banking empire of his own. And it didn't take long for the once small Banco Ambrosiano to become one of Italy's largest private banks. The question is, how did Calvi do it? In 1971, Roberto Calvi became the general manager of Banco Ambrosiano, and in 1975, chairman. It was around this time that Calvi followed in Sindona's footsteps and joined the Propaganda Due Masonic Lodge, also referred to as the P2 Lodge. This move would influence many things Calvi would do next. But first, he needed a way to move large sums of money without catching the eye of the board of Banco Ambrosiano, and maybe more importantly, the Bank of Italy. So in order to do this, Roberto Calvi used a holding company that was established in Luxembourg under the direction of Carlo Canisi in 1963. It was simply called the Banco Ambrosiano Holding Company. Calvi would then use this shell company to purchase a 70% stake in Banca del Gottardo in Switzerland and a controlling interest in Banca Cattolica del Veneto in Italy during the 1970s. Roberto Calvi was very calculated in choosing where to set up his shell companies. He understood places like Luxembourg offered very lax banking oversight, which enabled him to move money while bypassing Italian regulations. He would then use Banca Cattolica del Veneto for mostly domestic purposes, including channeling money to Rizzoli, a major publishing house that published Corriere della Sera, Italy's largest newspaper. This allowed the P2 Lodge to influence the newspaper, and along with it, public opinion. Their goal was to push anti-communist narratives that aligned with the Lodge's political stance during the Cold War. Calvi also signed off on loans for members of P2 like Carlo Pezzenti and financier Anna Bolcini to strengthen their businesses and extend P2's economic influence. But this is where things get even more interesting. The Vatican, through the president of the Vatican Bank, Paul Marcinkus, would send Calvi what were referred to as letters of comfort. These letters were non-binding assurances for these shell companies asking for massive loans from Banco Ambrosiano. The strangest part is only a couple weeks later, Calvi would send return letters completely absolving the Vatican from any legal or financial responsibilities for the loans, including the loans involved in political funding and propaganda due interests. A detail that has stumped investigators for years. But there were several reasons for the Vatican to take interest in Banco Ambrosiano's dealings. Firstly, the Vatican Bank held a small stake in Banco Ambrosiano and benefited from its vast financial network. Calvi, to give the facade of Banco Ambrosiano's growth, would use several of his shell companies that he sent millions of dollars to as loans from Banca del Gottardo in Switzerland to buy stock in his very own Banco Ambrosiano, making it a house of cards. But that's not all. The Vatican also had geopolitical interest in the overseas dealings as well, and strongly supported when hundreds of millions of dollars were sent to causes like the Solidarity Movement in Poland, coincidentally the homeland of the Pope John Paul II. However, Calvi's schemes didn't just stay in Europe. In South America, he expanded his operation. Banco Ambrosiano Andino in Peru and Banco Ambrosiano Group Commercial in Nicaragua. Both banks controlled by Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano Holding Company in Luxembourg. Using his Peru location, Calvi sent a $200 million loan which was used for the purchase of exocet missiles used during the Falklands War. Additionally, in Nicaragua, as part of the $400 million in offshore loans, he channeled large sums in support of the Nicaraguan Contras and Somoza regime, furthering Calvi's, P2's, and the Vatican's anti-communist efforts. That leads us back to the Cisalpine Overseas Bank in the Bahamas, the bank founded by Calvi, Sindona, and Paul Marcinkus in 1971. This was possibly Calvi's biggest player in his overseas dealings, acting as the central node to distribute large sums of money to his other shell companies as well as his political dealings. But this location also did something else. Just like his mentor, Mikel Sindona, Calvi also found himself laundering money for Mafia figures such as Giuseppe Calo through Cisalpine Overseas Bank, as well as his other shell companies. A connection many believe led to Calvi's future demise. In 1978, Calvi's house of cards began to fall. The Bank of Italy, prompted by suspicions of financial irregularities, specifically illegal currency exports, began investigating Banco Ambrosiano. The investigation found that $27 million had been illegally exported, leading to a criminal investigation. Calvi was convicted in 1981 and given a 4-year suspended sentence along with a fine totaling almost $20 million. During his short stint in jail, it was reported Roberto Calvi attempted suicide by either hanging or swallowing barbiturates. His family maintained his innocence and was adamant that he would never attempt suicide, implying an outside influence over Calvi. Once he was released, Calvi remained chairman of Banco Ambrosiano while awaiting the appeal process. What came next would cause a national fallout that Roberto Calvi's empire wouldn't survive. In March of 1981, during a raid on the villa of Lucio Gelli, the leader of the P2 Masonic Lodge, law enforcement found something that would cause a national fallout: the membership list of Propaganda du Lodge. 962 members, ranging from politicians, high-ranking military officers, judges, journalists, industrialists, along with bankers like Roberto Calvi. This exposure caused national outrage as the public saw just how deep P2's influence had become in society. As it turns out, Propaganda Lodge was unlike any other Masonic groups. Upon Lucio Gelli becoming the head of P2 in the mid-1970s, he hijacked the lodge and ran it as what was referred to at the time as a state within a state. Their goal was to undermine the left-leaning factions by using members like Calvi to help fund their schemes. The fallout from this exposure was monumental. A former minister was rushed to the hospital after swallowing barbiturates in a possible suicide attempt. An unnamed police chief shot himself. The Minister of Justice, Adolfo Sarti, resigned. Following in his footsteps just a week later, Prime Minister Arnaldo Forlani, along with the rest of his cabinet, also resigned. This came after the Italian Communist Party threatened a no-confidence vote unless the government acted on this scandal. On June 5, 1982, in a last-ditch effort to survive the impending collapse, Calvi wrote a letter to Pope John Paul II, pleading for help. This letter wouldn't be recovered until 2006. In it, Calvi said, "Holiness, a possible collapse of the Ambrosiano Bank will provide a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions in which the Church will suffer the gravest damage. It must be avoided at all costs." It was me, following the mandate of your authoritative representatives, who arranged significant financing of several countries and politico-religious associations in the East and West. It was me, in agreement with Vatican authorities, who coordinated across the whole of South America the establishment of numerous banking entities, mainly aimed at countering the penetration and expansion of neo-Marxist ideologies. It was me, finally, who was betrayed today by the very same authority for which I have always shown the utmost respect and obedience. He sought out a meeting with the Pope to explain, quote, everything that has happened and is happening, certainly without his knowledge. This meeting, however, never came to fruition. Calvi also mentioned he had received offers of support on the condition he detailed transactions done in the church's interest. To this he responded, I won't be blackmailed, and I won't blackmail in return. I have always been loyal, even when it's most dangerous. This correspondence suggests that key figures in the Vatican knew of the illegal dealings, directly tying the letters of comfort, and therefore the Vatican, to the corrupt and eventual downfall of Banco Ambrosiano. Perhaps that is why the Vatican Bank agreed to pay over $200 million to creditors following the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano later in 1984. They called it recognition of moral involvement in the bank's collapse. However, it was never determined the extent of the Vatican's knowledge in Calvi's illicit dealings. The infamous letter from Calvi was addressed at a later time by a high-ranking Vatican cardinal, Jose Castillo Lara, who said that the Pope never received Calvi's letter and dismissed it as, quote, statements made by a man struggling due to debts contracted elsewhere and unclear financial dealings. In June 1982, Banco Ambrosiano collapsed following the discovery of a debt of nearly $1.3 billion of unpayable loans to Calvi's shell companies. Roberto Calvi, seeing that all was lost, decided to flee. Acquiring a fake passport under the name Jean Roberto Calvini, he shaved his mustache to avoid recognition and fled to Milan, with his briefcase many believed contained incriminating evidence on Calvi's dealings with P2, the Mafia, and the Vatican. It is believed that here he connected with Flavio Carboni, a Sardinian businessman with Mafia ties, for help during this time. Calvi then fled to Venice before getting on a private jet to London with a stopover in Zurich, possibly to collect funds from his Switzerland subsidiary bank, Banca del Gottardo. While in London, Carboni arranged for Calvi to stay in a small apartment at Chelsea Cloisters. Carboni, along with Calvi's bodyguard, Silvano Vittor, would later recount this time as extreme paranoia and fear of betrayal from Roberto Calvi. On June 16th, he was removed from his position at Banco Ambrosiano by the Bank of Italy. That same day, Calvi's secretary, Graziella Carocher, jumped from the 5th story of the bank. She left behind a note condemning the actions of Calvi, saying, "May Calvi be double cursed for the damage he has caused the bank and all its employees." Her death was ruled a suicide. The very next day, at 7:30 a.m., Roberto Calvi himself was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London. He had almost $15,000 in his pockets from 3 different currencies, his fake passport, 12 pounds of bricks in his pockets from a nearby construction site, along with his expensive Philippe Patek watch still on his wrist. But there was one thing Calvi didn't have: his briefcase. This briefcase would never be seen again, adding to the mystery. But a closer look into Calvi's death brings more questions than answers. The autopsy confirmed death by asphyxiation. However, Calvi's neck didn't suffer the type of injury that would have occurred in a freefall. It was determined he didn't fall more than 2 feet before his fall was broken by the water. The first coroner's inquest lasted just 10 hours and ruled Calvi's death an open and shut case of suicide. There was no evidence Calvi had suffered any injuries from an assault prior to his death. There were no punctures in his skin suggesting he was given any drug to incapacitate him. Only residue in his stomach from a sleeping pill the coroners believed Calvi had taken the night before. Even though the initial ruling of suicide seemed likely considering the legal and likely personal troubles after losing the Mafia hundreds of millions of dollars, not to mention his alleged suicide attempt during his short jail stint in 1981, led some to believe this was just an open and shut case of suicide. However, Calvi's wife and son vehemently disagreed with this ruling. Believing Roberto had been murdered, proceeded to hire attorney George Carmen, who cited the rushed initial inquest and helped secure a second inquest a year later in 1983. This inquest would last 2 weeks and was a much more thorough investigation into all of the evidence surrounding Calvi's mysterious death. George Carmen suggested that Calvi was drugged using chloroform and then subsequently strangled. However, forensic pathologist Keith Simpson disagreed with this theory, citing the lack of evidence suggesting a violent struggle with his attacker. Furthermore, he found the position of Calvi's body when it was discovered consistent with suicide. He said there were no marks of fingers or fingernails which one would find in cases of strangulation by hand. I am satisfied that possibility can be altogether excluded. Simpson then pushed back on the claim that he was drugged, stating that chloroform didn't cause instantaneous unconsciousness and the victim would have struggled before succumbing to the drug. Due to the insufficient evidence, the jury couldn't rule it as a case of murder, so they concluded the second inquest with an open verdict. Calvi's family still insisted he had been murdered. So in 1991, they hired Kroll Associates to investigate Calvi's death, which was then assigned to senior investigator Jeff Katz. He brought in forensic scientist Angela Gallup to investigate and find the nature of Calvi's death. This is where things get very interesting. Firstly, Gallup paid a visit to the Metropolitan Police Forensic Science Laboratory to examine items recovered from the crime scene, including the bricks in Calvi's pockets, the rope that was tied around his neck, along with the clothes and shoes he was wearing at the time of his death. After this, she traveled to Milan to examine Calvi's luggage he had with him in London before his death. She was under strict orders not to take any tests or samples from the luggage. All she could do was examine. Several non-medical clues were used to determine the time Calvi was hung under Blackfriars Bridge. Firstly, his watch had stopped at 1:52 a.m., presumably because the water from the river. The tide of the Thames River that night would have been above his mouth before 1 a.m., and with no water in Calvi's body, we can presume he was hung after 1. However, after 2:30 a.m., the tide wouldn't have been high enough to reach Calvi's wrist, and since there was water on the face of his watch, they concluded he was hung between 1 and 2:30 a.m. The question then turned to, how did a 62-year-old man with vertigo get all the way up onto the scaffold? Gallup and her team looked at 4 possible routes. 2 of these routes, assuming Calvi traveled there himself, and 2 routes if he had been transported by his potential killers. What they found was damning. Angela Gallup and her team were looking for trace evidence like what was found on Calvi's clothes and shoes when his body was recovered. Using clothes and shoes unrelated to the night of Calvi's death, they tried to recreate the path Calvi would have taken had he committed suicide. The focus turned to Calvi's shoes, which had incurred damage, possibly from walking on rough ground at a nearby building site to pick up the bricks that were later found in his pockets. So attempting to retrace Calvi's steps, they reassembled part of the scaffold from that night, and a man named Russell Stockdale, who was built with a similar size and stature to Calvi, was tasked with climbing the scaffold and walking across, which was determined to be the minimum distance Calvi would have had to travel to reach the place where he was found. But what Gallup and her team found was astonishing. They did indeed find green paint fragments from the scaffold on the bottom of the shoes worn by Stockdale, but the paint found on Calvi's shoes was actually different than the paint on Stockdale's shoes. So there was actually nothing linking Calvi to the scaffold at all. Additionally, Stockdale climbed down the ladder and walked to the foreshore near Blackfriars Bridge like Calvi would have likely done before his death. Still, there was very little damage on his shoes compared to the damage on Calvi's shoes the night he died. Therefore, Gallup and her team transitioned to the murder scenarios of Calvi being transported to the bridge. That left the two most likely options. Calvi was either drugged or already dead, then lowered from the bridge onto the scaffold. Or because the height of the Thames River that night, it's possible he was transported by boat and hung from there. At the end of Gallup's investigation, it seemed highly unlikely Calvi, at the age of 62, overweight and with vertigo, walked along the foreshore and climbed the scaffold while weighed down by bricks, unaided. This conclusion was reinforced by the fact there was no evidence linking Calvi to the scaffold at all. The final report was submitted and dismissed by the London Police and the Home Secretary in October 1992. During this time, a former member of the Sicilian Mafia turned pentito, Francesco Marino Manoia, nicknamed Mozzarella, claimed that Calvi was targeted and killed by the Mafia in a contract killing after losing the Mafia hundreds of millions of dollars. Mozzarella believed Calvi's killer was Francesco Di Carlo, on the orders of Lucio Gelli and Giuseppe Calo, the latter already serving a life sentence for unrelated crimes since the mid-1980s. In 1996, Di Carlo became a cooperating witness and admitted Calo had approached him to kill Calvi, but he denied ever committing the act and instead believed that the murder was carried out by two men from another Italian mafia group called Camorra. Their names were Vicari and Vincenzo Casillo. In 1998, Calvi's body was exhumed, and Italian courts commissioned another forensic scientist to repeat the investigation from Gallup and her team. This report, finished in 2002, confirmed all of the findings from the original. Additionally, they were able to confirm Calvi never even touched the bricks in his pockets, but even more interestingly, his neck injuries were inconsistent with that of being hung. In 2003, the City of London Police reopened the case as a murder inquiry. And in July 2005, the former leader of Propaganda Dulage, Lucio Gelli, was notified that he was formerly under investigation for ordering the contract killing of Roberto Calvi. Interestingly, the members of P2 referred to themselves as Frati Neri, meaning Blackfriars. Perhaps it is nothing more than a mere coincidence, then, that Calvi was hung under Blackfriars Bridge. The investigation into the Grand Master of Propaganda Dulage included 4 other individuals who were also implicated in the murder: Giuseppe Calo, Ernesto Diotalivi, Flavio Carboni, and Carboni's girlfriend, Manuela Kleinzig. According to the indictment, these 5 ordered the murder of Calvi to prevent him from using blackmail power against his political and institutional sponsors from the world of Masonry belonging to the P2 Lodge, or to the Institute of Religious Works, with whom he had managed investments and financing with conspicuous sums of money, some of it coming from Cosa Nostra and public agencies. During this investigation, Lucio Gelli acknowledged Calvi was in fact murdered. However, he believed his death was ordered by the People's Republic of Poland. Although not a direct implication, his statement at least suggested that Calvi's involvement in funding the Solidarity movement while acting on the Vatican's behalf is what led to his death. Lucio Gelli was later dropped from the case when it went to trial later in October due to insufficient evidence for his involvement. However, there were still 5 individuals taken to trial and charged with the murder of Roberto Calvi: Giuseppe Calo, Flavio Carboni, Ernesto Diotalivi, Silvano Vittor, and Manuela Kleinzig. The trial lasted almost 2 years, and on June 6, 2007, Judge Mario Lucio D'Andrea threw out the charges, citing insufficient evidence. However, the court officially ruled Calvi's death a murder instead of a suicide. The defense successfully argued that there were plenty of people who wanted Calvi dead, including the Mafia and perhaps high-ranking officials in the Vatican wanting to silence God's banker. After the trial, legal experts stressed how difficult it would be to find concrete evidence 25 years after the murder. Jeff Katz later said, "The problem is that the people who probably actually ordered the death of Calvi are not in the dock, but to get to those people might be very difficult indeed." He also said it was probably true the Mafia carried out the murder of Calvi, but the people responsible were likely either missing or dead themselves. But this was still not the end. By June 2007, the prosecutor's office in Rome opened a second investigation into Lucio Gelli. In May 2009, the case against Gelli was once again dropped by the prosecution, citing the lack of evidence implicating Gelli in Calvi's death. And in May 2010, the acquittal of Calo, Carboni, and Diotalivi were confirmed by the Court of Appeals. A public prosecutor by the name of Luca Tescaroli commented after the acquittals that Calvi had been murdered for the second time. The death of Roberto Calvi remains shrouded in mystery to this day. Was it the Mafia with a score to settle? The Vatican silencing Calvi to cover up its own shady dealings? Or perhaps the British government held a grudge after Calvi helped fund Argentina's Exocet missiles used during the Falklands War? After many years of investigating and speculation, we are still left wondering who murdered God's banker and why.